Early in the 20th century, train crashes were staged just for fun. It was a popular family day out. 30,000 people paid to see this crash at a stadium in New York. Bits of wreckage made a fine souvenir. Crashes were a huge draw in the cinema too. But this was a bizarre form of entertainment. When pictures like these were shown for the first time, they were more terrifying, had even more impact than they do today. Because taking a train once meant taking your life in your hands. Disasters, real ones, were a dreadful fact of life. The safety standards we take for granted took 150 years to evolve. And usually, it took a major disaster before anything was done. The horror of a summer's day long ago, on a small branch line in Northern Ireland, exposed the dangers of rail travel like no event before or since. It was the worst rail disaster the world had seen. June the 12th, 1889, is still the darkest day in railway history. Its victims were the children of Armagh, and they thought this was to be the happiest day of the year.
A lot of the Sunday school children who would go to the various churches would never get a day away, and one of the great treats at the end of the year was to give them a free day by the seaside.
Just over 600 children were on board the Seaside Special, steaming up the gentle hills surrounding Armagh. But they'd never reached the seaside. On a hill a little steeper than the rest, passengers felt the train begin to slow down. It stopped. Suddenly, it became a runaway train, running backwards.
It simply went on gathering speed, and some of those who realized what was happening were actually able to climb out of the windows and jump.
The train was hurtling backwards downhill, out of control. It looked as though it might run all the way back into Armagh. But another train was speeding uphill on the same line.
The wooden carriages smashed into smithereens. Wreckage and people's bodies went down the embankment. They brought the soldiers from the barracks out to help, and all the local doctors gathered round, and they brought the casualties into the city hospital and the dead into the courthouse.
In the tangled wreckage of the Seaside Special, rescuers had found 80 bodies. Most of them were children.
Well, it was devastating. Armagh is a small city. It was a small city then. There was hardly a family that wouldn't have been affected. Some whole families were wiped out.
With its 2 cathedrals, Armagh is the religious capital of Ireland. Prayers were said for the children here and all over the British Empire. Queen Victoria sent £50 to help pay for the funerals. Press and public demanded to know why the trains had crashed.
This disaster compares in railway terms with what the Titanic was to shipping. And it came shortly after Parliament had refused to introduce some of the safety measures on railways because the railways claimed they would all cost too much.
The impact which this dreadful accident had was enormous. Public opinion was outraged, and the Railway Inspectorate, who overlooked railway safety, they were also outraged because for many years they'd been pressing the railway companies to improve their safety systems, but they didn't have the power to insist.
Suddenly, railways were on trial. At an inquiry in Armagh courthouse, investigators revealed an astonishing tale of criminal blunders. To sell more tickets, 3 extra coaches had been coupled to the Seaside Special at the last minute. All the doors were locked to keep the children in and fare dodgers out. The driver warned that his engine couldn't pull the weight, but he was ordered to go with a train that could barely struggle out of the station.
The train set off, and immediately it was faced with a gradient of 1 in 75, which in road terms is nothing, but in railway terms it is a steep gradient. The train laboured up this long 1 in 75 gradient until it was almost at the top, only about 200 yards from the summit. When the engine stalled because it just didn't have enough power to drag the whole heavy train over the top. The train crew then said, "What shall we do now?"
The driver had been proved right, but there was no turning back. And his next decision proved fatal.
The train crew would divide the train in two, take the first section up to the top of the hill, put it in a siding, the engine would come back for the second portion and take it up to the top, and they'd recouple the two parts together and go on their way. The second portion didn't immediately run back because the brake was on in the guard's van. The train crew were a bit worried about leaving the train on the gradient, and they placed stones on top of the rail behind the wheels, several stones. Everything would have been okay because the stones and the guard's brake held the second portion. As the engine started to take the first 5 coaches up the hill, the train just eased back slightly. A single handbrake wasn't sufficient to hold the train. The second portion started to run back, initially very slowly. So slowly, in fact, the train crew could walk alongside it. But then it increased speed, faster and faster. You can imagine the terror that was developing in this runaway train.
Why did 600 lives depend on a handful of stones? The coaches all had brakes, powered by a steam pipe from the locomotive. Normally, steam forced the brake shoes against the wheels, slowing them down. But when the driver split the train, he also had to separate the steam pipe. All the brake power was gone. A much safer system had already been invented. It worked on the same principle, but in reverse. Brakes were sprung permanently against the wheel unless there was steam power to free them. So whenever a train was split, or if power to the braking system failed for any reason, the brakes came on automatically. That's what it means to fail safe. Still, the disaster need not have happened. Why was another train speeding along a line that was already blocked?
In the early days of railways, when there were no means of communication between stations, there had to be some means of letting trains follow each other, one after the other, and keeping a safe interval between them. Generally speaking, after 5 minutes had elapsed, after a train had gone, a second train would be allowed to go, after the driver had been cautioned and told that there was a train in front of him only 5 minutes away. Not a very safe system if a train breaks down in midsection.
But a more modern signalling system had already been tried out on some lines. It used the electric telegraph to send messages between signal boxes. It made managing a railway as safe and as simple as running a train set. Sections of track between signal boxes were known as blocks. When a train passed a signal box, the signal would go up, and remained there until the train had cleared the block. The next train on the line would see the signal and have to stop. Only when the first train reached the next signal box would a message be sent saying the block was now clear and the train behind could proceed.
The accident happened on the 12th of June. An Act was hurriedly rushed through Parliament only 2 months later and compelled railway companies to adopt continuous automatic brakes and a proper signalling system, both of which would have prevented this accident from happening.
Block working, as it was called, dividing railways into sections with signals at either end, set a safety standard adopted across the world. It's still in use today. Coloured lights have replaced the signal arm, but the principle is exactly the same. Today, signal controllers sit in command centres often hundreds of miles from the signal itself. They control the train's journey through each block, these rectangles of light, on a screen. It had taken 70 years and the disaster at Armagh to realise the need for proper signals and brakes. But it also revealed the folly of building trains which broke up and splintered to matchwood in a collision. There were lessons to be learned here too. How long would that take? What are our chances of surviving a train crash today? Experience is a cruel but effective teacher. It took decades and many disasters to develop safe signals and brakes. But accidents weren't eliminated. The death toll went on rising because railway pioneers overlooked a vital factor: how to build trains which limit destruction so passengers have a chance of survival when the worst happens. The journey from then to now was a long and painful process. The Eurostar, on its way from Paris to London, is designed for speed and safety. Near Staplehurst in Kent, it crosses a narrow bridge, where all the dangers of the early railways were cruelly exposed. Long before the Eurostar, a southeastern railway express brought passengers returning from France on exactly the same route. The boat train, as it was known, collected passengers from the cross-channel ferry at Folkestone. This was 1865, railways still a new, a developing technology. The boat train's top speed of 45 miles an hour was something to marvel at. But how would it survive a crash? On June the 9th, repairs were underway on the bridge over the narrow river Bult. Workmen had begun removing old rails and replacing them with new ones.
This was quite a small bridge over a muddy stream, and rails were fitted on the top of the longitudinal timbers. Now the gang of men were changing these rails, and they'd almost finished the job, only one or two more to do. Now here is a potentially dangerous situation. There's no rails. If a train comes along, then you've obviously got a disaster.
At first, the train crew couldn't understand why there were people on the line. There was no repair work scheduled at that time. The workmen heard the whistle. The new rails were still not in place. They rushed to warn the train. Too late. Ten passengers were crushed to death in the wreckage of the boat train.
I was in the only carriage that did not go over into the stream. It hung suspended in an apparently impossible manner.
A survivor described the horror in a letter to a friend.
I got out with great caution. Suddenly, I came upon a man covered with blood. I couldn't bear to look at him. Then I stumbled over a lady lying on her back, with the blood streaming over her face. The next time I passed her, she was dead. In writing these words of recollection, I feel the shake, and am obliged to stop. Ever faithfully, Charles Dickens.
He had been travelling back from France, where he'd been for a number of weeks. He'd been finishing manuscripts for Our Mutual Friend, which would be his last completed novel, and caught the boat train. The fact that he had so narrowly escaped, and it was a very, very narrow escape for him, was quite a remarkable story. Detailed etchings were made of the accident and showing Dickens moving among the wounded, tending them.
It was the most sensational accident in railway's then brief history. The question on everyone's lips, why had the boat train met with disaster?
Because the train purely met the ferry from France, it left at a different time every day, changing every day because of the tides, of course. So a very complicated set of timetables was drawn up to take account for that. And the foreman of the works obviously got the wrong one. He was expecting the train 2 hours later in the day. He had sent a man down the track with a red flag to warn any oncoming train before it got to the bridge. Now, the man positioned himself purely by counting telegraph poles. Now, on this stretch of line, the telegraph poles were closer together than they were on a standard railway line, so he wasn't far enough back. All of these little incidences contrived to make sure that the train was coming over the bridge that wasn't completed at that time.
The public was shocked by a crash which nearly killed the most famous man of his time. There was an inquiry, but one key witness remained silent.
Charles didn't go to the inquiry because he needed to keep very quiet about his travelling companions. He was travelling with a young lady by the name of Ellen Turnham, and Ellen was, in fact, his mistress. With his position in society, he just couldn't afford for that fact to come out. But Victorian society wouldn't have accepted that at all.
In this crash, human error played its part. But why had a derailment so quickly turned into a disaster? What part did design play in the destruction of the boat train?
The couplings which held the train together were purely a screw coupling which went over a hook, and in this accident particularly, it wasn't strong enough to bear the forces exerted when the second and succeeding coaches fell into the stream. The screw coupling just snapped. Early in the 20th century, a new type of coupling known as a Buckeye coupling was devised, which was far stronger than the screw coupling and far less liable to break in two following a collision. And certainly in recent times, it's enabled trains to remain intact and upright following derailments.
Why had the carriages offered so little protection?
When the early railways came along, they were just stagecoaches on rails. They were made of wood, it was flimsy. In this accident particularly, even though they only fell 12 feet or so, they just fell on top of each other and each succeeding coach smashed up the one in front of it. The idea of having an all-steel coach didn't emerge until the 20th century, or half a century later.
But why would it take decades and many more disasters before safety became a factor in design? Trains built from stronger materials would be heavier and slower. They'd use more coal and carry less payload. For the owners, trains would cost more and earn less. They resisted safety laws. Everywhere, railways were expanding at a furious pace, at an astonishing cost in human lives. More than 6,000 people worldwide were killed in train crashes in 1890, almost 20 a day. It was only when safety coincided with good business sense that the death toll declined. Stronger couplings made for faster and heavier goods and passenger trains. In the 1930s, steel carriages began to appear. By the 1950s, they were a standard feature on most railways. They were safer, but also lasted longer, were more economical than the wooden ones of the previous century. A modern passenger express doesn't much resemble the boat train of Charles Dickens' time. Designers believed they'd made this train almost indestructible. It would be put to the test in an amazing series of accidents on one of the world's great railway journeys. Route 66, the road that first bridged America in 1935. But the railroad got here first. This line, sweeping through the Arizona desert, was laid out in 1883. It's one of the driest places in the world, but these bridges were built to protect against flash floods. Floodwater should pass under the line, leaving the tracks undamaged. But if a bridge failed, how would a train cope today? This is also the route of America's most famous transcontinental passenger train. The Southwest Chief runs from Los Angeles to Chicago. 2,220 miles in 2 days. Los Angeles Grand Union Station. On the evening of the 8th of August 1997, the last of 294 passengers made their way to the waiting train. They settled in for the long haul. The Southwest Chief rushed clear through California, crossing the Arizona state line in the early hours of the morning. At 5:30 a.m., a stop to change crews at the small railroad town of Kingman. Nothing unusual about this run, except the weather. In torrential rain and flash floods, the bridges were being put to the test, including one in particular, just to the east of Kingman.
The railroad did dispatch an inspector in order to assess the bridge, make a visual inspection. Just prior to when the chief passed over that particular bridge, a freight train had passed by that site going the opposite direction, that is going westbound, and there was no apparent damage to the bridge.
Like the boat train all those years before, the Southwest Chief was heading blindly into danger. Instead of 45 miles an hour, this train was doing 90. It thundered towards the bridge.
The locomotive crew did see the dip in the track, but of course, they were far too close to stop before crossing the bridge.
Dawn revealed a scene of devastation. In the panic and confusion, rescuers radioed for more help. They reported at least 8 passengers dead, injured unknown. The torrent had washed away most of the bridge, leaving just the metal rails to support the weight of the train. Where the timber supports had been, now one of the Southwest Chief's sleeper cars straddled the gap. But as the sun climbed higher, everyone at the scene began to view things in a new light. Doctors took a head count at Kingman High School, where the injured had been taken. A passenger list was found. Then they counted again, in astonishment. Everyone was safely accounted for. What had seemed like a disaster began to look more like a miracle. The Southwest Chief had won this battle with the elements. But this was just round one. Earthquake. On October the 16th, 1999, a severe earthquake, 7 on the Richter scale, shook California. The epicenter was in the Mojave Desert, 100 miles east of Los Angeles. It struck at 2 in the morning, exactly when the Southwest Chief was passing through. The train was shaken right off the tracks. Rescuers could hardly believe that once again, no one was killed in this derailment at 60 miles an hour. 4 people were injured, but the battered carriages remained upright. Surely this train had passed the test. Not yet. On March the 15th, 2000, at 2 in the morning, the Southwest Chief crashed for the 3rd time, rounding a bend at 60 miles an hour when it left the tracks near Topeka, Kansas. There were 155 passengers and crew on board. 35 needed hospital treatment, but no one was killed. 3 high-speed crashes in 3 years. What saved the passengers on the Southwest Chief?
The principal thing is that the train did remain intact. The couplers are very effective in keeping the cars together. They are very effective in essentially keeping the whole train together.
These couplings were designed to survive a derailment at 90 miles an hour, a huge advance on designs of 150 years ago.
The earlier couplers that were used in passenger equipment allowed substantial vertical motion. Matter of fact, they were pretty much unrestrained. If you took a car that was in the middle of a train and tried to lift it up, you'd have no difficulty doing that. One might expect if you had those kinds of couplers that the cars would indeed come undone and you'd essentially end up with a large pile of what used to be passenger cars.
The carriages too were a state-of-the-art design, actually built with a collision in mind.
You have the strong part of the cars that can crush in a controlled fashion, which hopefully should limit the amount of injuries and the severity of injuries that an occupant might experience during a collision.
To cross the states, the Southwest Chief has to carry huge amounts of fuel, 2,000 gallons in a single tank. Fire is what can turn a derailment into a disaster. But the train had fuel tanks of a brand new design.
And this particular train has fuel tanks which are located up inside the car body itself rather than a frame-suspended fuel tank which we've seen on earlier equipment. Having more ground clearance provides for space that debris and track that is damaged in a derailment to harmlessly pass beneath the locomotive and hence not puncture the fuel tank.
It's the unluckiest train in the world, but maybe the toughest too. The Southwest Chief proved the worth of designing for a disaster, proved how far we've come in the 150 years since the boat train ran off the bridge and shattered into pieces. But sometimes, even the most modern design is little help. A derailment is one thing, a head-on crash is quite another. The worst disasters happen when drivers ignore the signals of danger ahead. Experts have been trying to prevent that for almost 100 years.
Rush hour in Washington, D.C. Commuters must choose between traffic jams or taking the train. One of the train systems serving the Maryland suburbs is known as the MARC train. Eastbound routes from Brunswick approach Washington through the suburb of Silver Spring. This line also carries one of the country's busiest long-distance express trains, the Capital Limited, westbound, Washington to Chicago. At 5:20 p.m. on February 16, 1996, the Capital Limited was preparing to depart. Its regular single daily run is still in the timetable today. 164 passengers boarded on the day in question. The travelers settled into their seats. Those going all the way to Chicago were looking at an 18-and-a-half-hour journey. There was no reason to feel unsafe. The dinner menu occupied their attention as the express train gradually gathered speed.
Dinner reservations. Dinner reservations.
MARC Train 286 was a train like this, with single-deck passenger cars. On February 16th, there were only 20 passengers, many of them co-workers returning to Washington after a training course. Many were tired after a long day, the train rocking them almost to sleep. But they were on a collision course with an express train at a closing speed of 70 miles an hour.
Fire department, how can I help you?
There's a train that derailed. It is on fire.
Is it a freight train or is it a passenger train?
It looks like an Amtrak train.
A passenger train derailed. From the first call, emergency response teams feared the worst.
And it's on fire, you say?
Yes.
Okay, we're on the way for that.
Neighbors couldn't believe the scene that was unfolding.
I was, looking out the window, first thing I seen was just like train on top of train, fire, smoke everywhere.
11 passengers were killed. Some were crushed on impact. Others suffered a more terrible death, trapped inside the MARC train, doors jammed shut, the windows unbreakable.
It was just burning, twisted, kids screaming. It was a very eerie scene, kids coming in and out of smoke, banging on the window itself.
A diesel tank on the express train had sheared off and burst, spraying fuel inside the MARC train.
I just jumped on the train and started kicking the windows and jumped down and tried to get rocks and threw at the windows. It would not break. This glass was impossible to break.
Images of the disaster were on TV within minutes.
As soon as I saw it on television, I knew I needed to respond. It was pretty clear as soon as we arrived on scene that the two trains hit each other at a crossover, a junction between tracks. In a situation like that, your first response is that there's a signals failure.
What color signal was being displayed at the crucial moment? The answer was 700 miles away. Washington's signal system is run from a control room in Jacksonville, Florida.
Tower 305 radio shift.
We determined that the signal system had functioned properly. It had displayed the proper signal for the Amtrak train, was coming toward that signal and then going from one track to another track on a crossover. The MARC train had a stop signal, and he was supposed to have stopped in advance of the crossing.
Investigators looked for any clue that might help explain the driver's actions.
We considered that the weather could have been a factor. Because it was in fact snowing, maybe you couldn't see the signal. After talking with other engineers that had been in the area, we decided that the weather was not a factor either.
All the fatalities were on the MARC train, including the driver and two crew members in the cab with him. For investigators, it was now pure detective work, but without the key witnesses. Again and again, investigators tried to relive the last few moments of MARC Train 286. What had the driver actually seen? First, a yellow warning signal, meaning prepare to stop at the next set of lights, 2 miles further down the track. Then a stop at Kensington to pick up passengers. But why had the driver accelerated after a warning of danger ahead? This is what he saw approaching a blind bend at 60 miles an hour. Suddenly a signal showing red. The driver immediately hit the brakes. As a last desperate measure, he threw the train motor into reverse. But with this much track remaining, it was too late to stop. Confused and frustrated, and determined to discover why these trains crashed, investigators could only guess at the cause. But why, when the means of finding an answer are already available? By law, black box data recorders have been installed on all U.S. trains since 1996. They give a complete technical breakdown of a train's last journey and often provide vital evidence in piecing together events leading up to an accident. Of course, the black box must survive the immense forces unleashed when trains collide. This impact test simulates a head-on crash at 80 miles an hour. The steel casing must protect the delicate components inside. But that isn't the only factor in disasters like Silver Spring. The box is placed in a furnace designed to match the intense heat of a train fire, nearly 2,000 degrees, for an hour. If the data is still readable after this abuse, the recorder is considered crashworthy. Data from the recorder in the MARC train was anxiously examined in the hope it would provide the critical breakthrough.
You can tell when the engineer is applying brakes, when he's changing speeds on the train. We looked at the train equipment itself, and we found no problems with any of those things. You're reduced to trying to figure out why an experienced engineer, familiar with the territory, familiar with that particular run, would disregard a signal. He's supposed to maintain a speed of no greater than 30 miles an hour, prepared to stop. In fact, he got his speed as high as 66 miles an hour.
What could have been the fatal distraction?
Nominal. You're breaking up. What'd you say?
Drivers deal with constant radio traffic from their control room and other trains. Records reveal that the conversation moments before the collision had to do with snowballs.
There's some kids on the side of the track throwing snowballs at the train. So he contacts an oncoming MARC train, tells him that, watch out, there are some kids along the side of the track throwing snowballs.
In the confusion, did the driver even see the yellow warning signal, then call it out to the conductor beside him as the rules require?
We believe he called it out. We believe that he probably called it out correctly. Had we had a recording device that recorded voice, that would have captured those conversations. We would have known exactly what was said.
Why can't they be sure? There's a surprising loophole in the safety law that prevents the black box from being fully effective. Cockpit voice recorders often explain why planes crash. Why not when trains crash?
There are two problems with the voice recorders in the view of industry and labor. The crew are in a train up to 12 hours a day in, day out. There are many times that they have just general conversations, personal, private, whatever. And the concern is that this information would be used to charge the employee for certain violations of railroad regulations. Now, the industry side would have a concern because if I am injured in an accident and I have access to this recorder, and here we have hours of chatting about the baseball game or a football game, You can see how that would play in front of a jury. If I were a rail manager, I would certainly have concern about it.
In the U.S., voice recorders top the wish list for accident investigators. This loophole in the law may mean the cause of these deaths will forever remain an unsolved mystery, and so will the causes of other disasters in the future. If a train weighing 20,000 tons is heading your way at 60 miles an hour and it gets this close, understand, it's not going to stop. What makes train travel so unique makes it dangerous too. Steel wheels on steel rails minimize friction to maximize speed. It's a massive trade-off against safety. A gamble which the earliest railway pioneers quickly recognized. What happens when you try to stop the train? When friction is vital? At that point, steel on steel is the last thing you need. Because trains have such long stopping distances, they need plenty of warning when danger is present. Yellow signals mean stark braking. The next signal, maybe more than a mile away, will be red. Early in the last century, something called ATC, automatic train control, was introduced. It alerted drivers to yellow signals. A ramp between the tracks sent a magnetic impulse to a sensor underneath the train. That sensor was linked to a visual display in the cab known as the sunflower dial. When a ramp was passed, the sunflower turned black and an alarm sounded. The driver then had to override the alarm or the brakes would go on automatically. This simple system was ahead of its time. Companies said it was too costly to install. 50 years passed before two huge disasters underlined the need for this kind of warning device. When Why Trains Crash continues. In 1952, 112 passengers were killed in a devastating three-train pileup at Harrow, outside London. In 1957, 90 passengers were killed when two trains crashed at Lewisham in southeast London. In both cases, drivers had ignored yellow warning signals. There was a public outcry, and the widespread introduction of automatic train control, or ATC, was mandated. A similar device is still in use today, hardly altered 100 years after it was first invented. Its biggest weakness is that drivers can become so used to canceling the alarm that it might as well not be there. But alternatives are costly.
During recent years, there has been an increasing tendency on the part of the relevant decision makers to employ what I, as an economist, would regard as legitimate cost-benefit methods in the assessment of rail safety.
The key question today isn't which safety device works best, but how much does it cost? Exactly how much are we willing to spend to prevent rail disaster fatalities? Other countries wrestle with the same cost-benefit analysis. One figure that the British train companies have come up with as the price of saving one life is £3 million. That's about $4.5 million. But there's a problem with this way of thinking. Lots of people have to die to prove that a safety system is worth installing.
In hard-nosed terms, the more corpses there are, the more likely it is to be undertaken.
All safety systems are an attempt to compensate for human error. After all, it was a case of bad judgment that led to the worst rail disaster the world had ever seen.
Speed is what put railways on the map, getting there and getting there fast. But speed has come at a price, in wrecked trains, injuries and death. We all want to go fast, but are we prepared to pay the price?
911 emergency.
911 emergency. We need police, fire, ambulance.
Get a hold of somebody to stop that train. I could tell definitely there was something wrong with the bottom of the train.
I would like to report a train has come off the track.
The railroad car initially was shaking violently. Then there was a sudden impact. It was a nightmare.
The world record holder on the rails. This is the maglev. It can travel at 340 miles per hour. The Japanese train hovers a few inches above the track as it is propelled forward. The closest yet to a flying train, maglev is only in its testing phase, but its breathtaking speed means that the Japanese are marketing it as the train of the future. Speed is an irresistible draw. We can never go fast enough. But the faster we go, the less time we have to assess the risks we take. Throughout their history, train companies have known that speed is the one sure way to attract passengers. Publicity stunts lured them onto the tracks. On and on the rail companies raced, their eyes on the prize, the rewards that would come to the one that could go fastest.
Faster yet and faster, eating up the miles, and she's still accelerating. A supreme effort, and Coronation has done it. 114 miles an hour, the highest speed yet attained in the Empire.
More speed meant more passengers, more profits, more risk. Speed and danger were fellow travelers. A dilemma vividly illustrated in an incident at the beginning of the last century, and a problem that haunts the railways to this very day. The attempts of two rival rail companies to compete against each other and satisfy their passengers ended in tragedy. The Great Western and the London and South Western Railways both operated a service from Plymouth to London. The two companies' routes actually met at Exeter Station. They both carried passengers off the transatlantic steamers arriving from New York. But Great Western controlled the signals at Exeter, and it was a known fact that their signalmen sometimes held up their competitors' trains deliberately. As the steamers approached the English Channel, a lighthouse off the Cornish coast would telegraph ahead to warn the railway that a boat was on its way. Down at the terminal, fires were lit in the waiting rooms, and everyone stood by to wait for the arrival of the passengers. Most passengers were wealthy New Yorkers, newly arrived in Britain. The boat train was known as the Yank Express and guaranteed to transport them to London as quickly as possible. There wasn't a published timetable for the train, but a speed table, which simply stated that it would take 4 hours and 20 minutes to travel the 218 miles to London. The London and South Western boat train left Devonport at about 11 o'clock on the night of Saturday the 30th of June, 1906. It was an express service. On the footplate were driver Robbins and fireman Gadd from Nine Elms Depot in London. They were due to arrive at about 3:20 on the Sunday morning. Meanwhile, the rival Great Western service had also set off on its own route, but the London and South Western was still ahead, approaching Salisbury station.
It had lost a little bit of time from Temple Combe and had been running about 4 minutes late, but it was running at possibly about 70 miles an hour, making up time. About a mile west of the station, the driver sounded the whistle and then continued to run at full speed towards the station. He hurtled through the station at probably 60, 70 miles an hour until the train reached the curve at the east end of the station.
The Yank Express had left the track completely, smashing headlong into a nearby milk train, slicing it in half. The sound of the crash woke the whole town. When day broke, the true extent of the damage could be seen. Driver Robbins, fireman Gadd, and 23 out of the 43 passengers on board, plus the guard of the milk train, had all been killed in the smash. The derailment at Salisbury shocked the nation. Crowds gathered at the site of the accident, and the Queen sent a message of condolence to the American ambassador. As an investigation began, experts agreed that Salisbury Station was notoriously hard for drivers to navigate. At the east end of the station, there was a sharp curve which had a speed limit of 30 miles an hour, but the boat train had been doing at least 70. As soon as news of the derailment spread, speculation began about the reason for this high speed. Much was made of the competition between the London and South Western and Great Western railways. Their rivalry was well known.
There were various rumours going around that the train had been racing. About the time that the accident happened, the Great Western were actually going to open a shorter route to London. So there was a suggestion that maybe driver Robbins was trying in a piece of rivalry to beat the Great Western.
Surviving passengers told the investigation they'd been frightened by the speed. It was going so fast, they said, they couldn't keep their plates on the dining car tables. The investigation simply concluded that the smash was due to excessive speed on a curve. The incident became a national talking point. It also made a serious impression in the minds of rail passengers. But that wasn't quite the end of the story. After the investigation closed, another accusation was made. As well as blaming competing rail companies, it appeared that some of the passengers themselves had bribed the driver to get them to London in record time. Since the wreck of the Yank Express, all trains have been made to stop at Salisbury Station. In addition, the speed limit on the deadly curve at the eastern end of the station was reduced to 15 miles an hour, a limit still in force today. At Salisbury, 3 factors led to disaster. Rival companies were competing on rival routes. The driver was determined to keep on schedule because his train was running 4 minutes late. And passengers seemed to have pressured him to reach their destination as fast as possible. Nearly 100 years later, it is surprising how few lessons we seem to have learnt from the past. At Southall in 1998, a high-speed passenger train owned by Great Western Trains, the modern descendant of one of the 2 rival boat trains, went through a red signal at around 90 miles per hour. It ploughed into a freight train crossing the track in front of it. 7 people died and 150 were seriously injured. Evidence suggested that the pressure not to delay the train could have been one of the factors that led the driver on the route from Swansea to London to take the train out, even though its automatic brake warning system was broken. This was a major cause of the accident. During the court case, the judge summed up by saying, "Those who travel on high-speed trains are entitled to expect the highest standard of care from those who run them, and Great Western trains failed to meet that standard." As the causes of tragedies at Southall and Salisbury reveal, it isn't just the pure speed of a train which can contribute to disaster. It's getting there on time that can take speeding trains out of control. It's what the passenger wants, but the pressures of the timetable can have dangerous consequences. Railways were the first form of transport to lay down in writing the claims they were making for exact journey times with speed and punctuality. They were called railway timetables. They had a fundamental effect on the whole of society.
Yes, we'd love to come and see you. Should we come by that midday train on Saturday?
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll catch the 3:15. Be with you at 4 o'clock. All right.
Before the railways, there was no standard time. All time was local time, and everywhere was different. In the 1840s, clocks in the West Country were set 20 minutes behind the clocks in London. But with published timetables to run to, the railways had to make sure that all the station clocks, at least, were set to the same time. Passengers began to set their watches to run in time with the railways. It led to one standard time being adopted in 1847. In the USA, it was called railroad time.
Right on the dot.
Four and a half hours for this trip is certainly traveling. I can remember when it took 7 hours.
7 if you were lucky.
But by associating itself with tight timekeeping, the railway was making a rod for its own back. Passengers expected, and today demand, that trains keep to their timetables more strongly than with any other form of transport.
I'll tell you your job. I can't get to mine for you.
This insatiable demand to get there on time has forced trains to push speed to its limit. But making them go faster is only one half of the problem. Arriving in one piece means slowing down and stopping at your destination. And the better the technology to speed trains up, the more critical it is to slow them down. It takes a train traveling at 125 miles an hour, 1¼ miles to come to a complete standstill once the brakes are applied. A train braking system has to be able to resist forces of several thousand tons. The same scientific principle which overcomes friction to allow steel wheels on steel tracks to propel huge loads at high speeds also makes it hard to bring them to a halt.
In January 1994, the effort to slow and stop this train ended in disaster. Powered by 2 locomotives, the train is almost a mile long and weighs 4,000 tons. It pulls 53 cars containing 300 people and 60 animals. While this American town sleeps, the train passes almost unnoticed. It's home to the Ringling brothers, Barnum and Bailey Circus, which has toured the country in its own custom-built train since the 19th century. Traveling 17,000 miles per year, the train has apartments with air conditioning, heating and cooking facilities for the performers, and specially reinforced freight cars, which can take the weight of full-grown elephants. Out of the train comes a tapestry of magic and spectacle as the circus unloads 15 elephants, 150 performers, zebras, tigers, costumes, custard pies, lighting equipment, and an orchestra. This is quite a performance. On January 13, 1994, the circus had finished a week of shows in St. Petersburg, Florida, and was on its way to Orlando. It never arrived.
You're looking at live pictures at the scene near Lakeland. The circus was coming to town, but there are no happy faces. The Ringling brothers train derailed, creating mayhem.
Surprisingly, there were a number of witnesses who had seen not only the crash itself, but the sequence of events leading up to the crash. Using their testimony, investigators assembled a picture of the train's last journey. It left St. Petersburg, Florida at 7:30 a.m., traveling due east in the direction of the city of Lakeland. As it passed, witnesses along the track began to notice that something was wrong. A local man driving his van to work had to pass the railroad to reach a nearby garage.
I come up to the intersection at the railroad crossing and the lights were blinking. I was the first one at the gate, so I decided to go ahead and shut my van off that I was in and noticed the circus train. As it went by the van, the noise dissipated and went past me. The next thing I heard was a very loud squealing. Sounded like one of the wheels on the track. There was something wrong with it. I could tell definitely there was something wrong with the bottom of the train.
10 minutes later, an ambulance driver taking a patient to the hospital in New Haven radioed his dispatch with an unusual message.
ALS 11, the comm scene. The train tracks run parallel to the road, and coming towards me was a train. As I looked towards the end of the train, I could see what would appear to be smoke coming from one of the wheels. And I didn't think much of it at first, but as it got closer, the smoke seemed to get worse and worse and worse. But when it got close enough to where I could see what it really was, when I noticed the wheel had come off the track next to the car, it was digging up the gravel on the side of the railroad tracks.
A car mechanic was working at his garage near the railroad track on the outskirts of town.
We heard a loud commotion, and it took us a few seconds to realize that it was coming from the train track. So we walked out in the middle of the parking lot, and we saw a train come by with a center train car sticking halfway off the track, and it was throwing rocks and debris all over the place up here on customers' cars. We could tell immediately there was a problem with the train and it probably was going to derail, and we hoped it wouldn't be right here.
Lakeland Police Department, 911 emergency.
911 emergency.
You need police, fire, ambulance.
Get a hold of somebody to stop that train.
Police, fire, ambulance.
Like to report a train has come off the track.
Frantic calls jammed the switchboard of the local police station, but no one could stop the circus train.
Well, in the morning of the derailment, I was approximately 30 cars back from the locomotive. I was awake, lying in bed. I just received a wake-up call from the conductor that we were approximately an hour outside of Orlando. I was basically just mulling over how I was going to park the train when we arrived and what my normal duties would be as far as unloading the train. The railroad car initially was shaking violently, and the dishes were clattering, my pictures on the wall were clattering, and then there was a sudden impact. It was a nightmare. When I got out of the car, you could see railroad coaches spread out everywhere. They were on their sides. They were torn open, like the sheet metal was removed from the sides of the railroad cars in certain cases. Cars on top of each other. It was horrible.
When I got to the wreckage, everything was quiet, and these two little kids came out the window, and so I decided to go in there because they said that my dad's in there.
And there were people trying to comfort the boys, but they just ran from person to person, you know, begging for their father.
The boy's father, who was an elephant trainer, had been killed, as well as a clown. The circus was in ruins. In addition to the 2 fatalities, 15 people were badly injured. The train was almost completely destroyed. Only the animal cars remained unharmed.
The sad truth of the whole thing was, and we knew it right then and there, was that we could replace the train. We could replace the furniture and all the things we'd lost. We couldn't replace the 2 people.
The investigators got to work right away.
Upon arriving at the scene, you take a look at an accident, what looks to you as the obvious cause of the accident, which, with my experience, does not always end up to be the cause of the accident. So what we have to do is we look into every area with an open eye.
Witness accounts suggested that the train had a mechanical problem. The next step was to collect evidence from the site itself.
I myself began to walk southward away from the track to trace the movement of the train.
By the trackside, investigator Michael Martino found train debris, including brake shoes, wheel parts, and broken lights, which were collected for tests. Investigators also looked for evidence of the train's last movements. Then they found an important piece of evidence, a broken wheel that had come apart from the train and was still lying by the side of the track.
We were informed by an eyewitness that he had seen pieces of wheel come off the train 4 or 5 miles south of the location of the accident. We dispatched an investigator, and they were able to retrieve the pieces of this particular wheel.
Investigators saw that a furrow had been plowed down the middle of the railroad ties. From this, they could deduce that a train wheel had dragged along the middle of the track for nearly 2 miles before the train derailed. From evidence so far, the fractured wheel looked like an important factor, so the pieces were sent off to Colorado for testing by metallurgist Dan Stone.
I was particularly interested to see what triggered the fracture, and it was a small crack on the back rim of the wheel that was about 3/4 of an inch deep. I observed a semicircular crack that had an oyster shell appearing surface, quite bright and shiny, that triggered the rest of the wheel failure down into the center of the wheel. This type of failure is rather typical of a wheel that has been overheated and overbraked. The way in which this wheel cracked indicated to me that it was really a symptom of some malfunction in the braking system.
The circus train used a system of braking in which brake shoes were forced against the tread of the wheels. As the pressure of the shoes increases, the rim of the wheel heats up. During braking, the movement of the train allows most of the heat to escape into the air and into the rails. But the crack on the circus train wheel looked like a heat fracture. On this wheel, for some unknown reason, the heat must have built up instead of escaping when the brakes were applied. Still, investigators found no other evidence of problems with the braking system. The circus train had even been inspected on the track only 1 hour before the derailment, and no problems with the brakes had been spotted then. Back at the site of the derailment, the next step was for trainmaster Tom Dillon and the investigators to go inside the wrecked train to assess the damage and search for other clues.
Pretty much all of our personal belongings were destroyed due to the derailment. The difference between the circus train and a passenger train is that, in the circus train, that's our home. It had been my home for 8 years. That's the difference. It was our home. It wasn't a one-way train.
The fact that the train was a home was a crucial element in the tragedy. Falling furniture crushed and killed the elephant trainer and the clown as the train came off the tracks. Eight months later, everything was still up in the air for the survivors. Bravely putting on performances but still homeless, they traveled around the country, waiting for investigators to solve the mystery so their train could be rebuilt. The breakthrough came when one of the investigators came up with a revolutionary suggestion. He realized that the key to the whole event might be a tiny serial number stamped on the train wheel. Each of the wheels, including the broken one, had an identification brand mark which showed the serial number of the wheel. The broken wheel was branded with a number 4.
We felt that we were onto something. Once we put the wheel together and we noticed where the cracks were, the one crack was right by the long part of the 4, so we were very, very focused on that one part there that seemed to be a causal element to the accident.
The process of rim stamping the wheels with a mark can sometimes weaken the steel. But could this 1/4-inch numeral really be the factor which had brought the 4,000-ton train off the tracks? The circus train was classified as a freight train. New freight trains have curved plate wheels, which allow plenty of airflow over the curve of the wheel surface. But the circus train was a custom-made design that still used discontinued straight plate wheels. The flat surface of these wheels didn't allow the air to circulate, so when the brakes heated up the wheel, it didn't cool down again.
It had a brake up against a straight plate wheel. What made the matters worse was that you had a stamp or a punch on the inside of the wheel that created a crack. Well, the heat that was that you'd have here that would normally dissipate was more intense, so that created the crack even further and faster.
The investigation into the circus derailment demonstrated that individually safe features of engineering could be fatal when combined as they were on the circus train.
In any investigation, you have a situation of variables coming together, and if you eliminate any one of those systems, the incident doesn't occur. In this instance, it did occur because you had the type of braking system, the type of wheel, and a type of stamp.
The train's inhabitants are now back on board, and it's business as usual for the circus. Major modifications have been made to the circus train to prevent another disaster. New curved plate wheels and disc brakes allow the heat from braking to escape more easily. An in-car communication system has been installed so that if any of the passengers on the train notices a problem, they can immediately call the driver. All furniture is now firmly fixed to the body of the train. The lessons learned in this investigation have been used to improve safety on other trains, too. Since the time of the accident, straight plate wheels are no longer used on freight trains here in the U.S., and rim stamping of serial numbers onto wheels has also been discontinued. The Circus train was specially designed to give the most comfortable ride, not only to passengers, but to a whole menagerie. But in commercial passenger trains, trying to achieve comfort together with high speeds can be the undoing of even the most cutting-edge design. Attempts to stop rattling coffee cups on a dining car ended in the deaths of over 100 people in one of the most horrible train crashes of recent years.
When trains were first invented, impressing the passengers was easy. Early steam engines were slow, but the novelty and excitement of rail travel made them an instant success. Soon, trains could also travel at top speeds, but they had to rely on more than just speed to keep them in business for long. In the 20th century, other modes of transport soon began to win over the public. By the 1930s, train supremacy was broken forever. First, it was the motor car, which offered the comfort and luxury of traveling in your own personal vehicle, as well as traveling fast. Then came an even more serious challenger in terms of public transport, the aeroplane. Technologically, the plane won hands down. Trains had now been overtaken, and they had to find another way to compete. Their new tools were comfort and luxury. Advertisements started to appear that would help to keep trains in business by stressing the comfort as well as the speed of train travel.
New refinements become the keynote of railroad endeavor. To increase efficiency and catch the public eye, streamlining enters railroading. One road so disregards tradition that it goes to a private industrial designer, receives plans for a train which is ultra-modern and so fleet that it will actually challenge airplane time between Cleveland and Detroit.
And rail didn't give up easily. In 1964, the Japanese unveiled the bullet train, or Shinkansen, a serious rival to air travel. The technological feature which set the bullet apart from other trains was an electric motor driving system in each car. The extra power this gave meant that it could travel at speeds of 125 miles per hour, at that time the fastest regular service in the world. But the bullet train was more than just a speed demon. It also pampered its passengers. Bullet was the first train to beat aircraft at their own game. In fact, the bullet train even looked like a plane. Bullet had the goods over air travel because there were no lengthy check-in times, and the Shinkansen stations were in city centers, not miles out of town like the airports. Although the bullet could never beat the plane for pure speed, what it did do was to adopt the luxury and comfort that people had grown accustomed to in the air and give it to them on the tracks. It was such a successful combination that Japanese passengers started to choose rail over air travel. The Japanese took trains worldwide into the future, encouraging other countries to follow with the winning combination of speed and comfort. Rail seemed to have found the formula to compete successfully again, but the new emphasis on comfort and image reached such a level on some railways that the bid to court passengers ended in tragedy. In 1991, the German railway, Deutsche Bahn, launched the new Intercity Express, or ICE, and with it, a new image. The ICE was the latest in railway innovation. Aimed at Germany's most discerning travelers, it offered them a chance to sit back and enjoy. The new trains had reclining armchair-style seats, some with personal videos. The interior was soundproofed for the comfort of the passengers. There were picture windows to admire the German countryside, and information displays which boasted of the train's performance. They posed as the ultimate in indulgence and cutting-edge technology. At their launch, they made a great impression on German travelers like Petra Sebastian. Since then, she's vowed never to travel by train again.
Schnell wie möglich nach Hamburg zu kommen.
I chose the ICE in order to get to Hamburg as quickly as possible, and also for the sheer thrill of travelling at nearly 190 miles per hour. I was really happy because I love travelling by train. Once, when I was in Munich, I was standing on a bridge and saw one coming in, and I thought, wow, the ICE.
Behind the scenes, things weren't going to plan with the train's launch. Despite heavy promotion by Deutsche Bahn, there were problems with the new restaurant cars, which were being badly affected by the train's high speeds.
As a company, we were responsible for building the restaurant cars and also the express train coaches. After a relatively short running time, very powerful vibrations occurred. These were felt very strongly in the restaurant car, with the cups starting to wander, or glasses clinking, or the spoons falling down, and things like that. It was very unpleasant, so something had to be done to all the coaches.
While discussions were going on between engineers, German passengers flocked to use the new trains. Petra Sebastian was one of 65,000 people carried every day by the ICEs.
I got on the ICE and it was 9:30, and I'd be sitting on the train until 12. There was a nice smell of coffee and croissant. I thought I can go and have something to drink there later, because I've never had a meal in an ICE dining car. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to look forward to.
Meanwhile, Deutsche Bahn was still trying to find a solution to the problem of the vibrations. They could either rebuild the track, which would be a major expense and disrupt the service, or use a different type of wheel. They decided to change the wheels. The design they chose had a cushioning layer of rubber between two layers of steel. The wheels are known as duo block. The original wheels had been going out of shape due to the stresses of wear at high speeds, and that stopped them running smoothly. The rubber cushioning on these new wheels absorbed the movements of the train, so the metal wheel was no longer under such stress. It was hoped that this would stop the vibrations. The duo-block wheels certainly seemed to make the restaurant cars more comfortable, and coffee cups and a la carte meals sat steadily on the tables. On the morning of June the 3rd, 1998, the Munich to Hamburg service left on time on its journey through the center of Germany. In coach 9, Petra Sebastian was relaxing on her way for a holiday in Bavaria. But something about the train didn't feel right.
The first feeling of unease in the ICE was when I had the sensation that it had just run over something. That's when I thought, there's something wrong here, this isn't normal. Then there was a strange movement as the train swayed left and then right. I probably held tight because of the sudden pull, and I remember thinking, we can't be derailing, that's impossible.
By now, the train was traveling at 124 miles an hour, and Petra was right. It was leaving the tracks.
It was a bit like an accordion, swinging first to the left and then to the right. Then there was this huge bang further ahead, followed by this sudden pulling, as if a gigantic vacuum was trying to suck me in. I opened my eyes and looked around me, and everything was reduced to rubble.
The train had been almost completely destroyed. When the emergency services arrived, they counted 101 dead and 88 injured. It was the worst rail disaster in Germany for 40 years. Petra's carriage was torn apart. She was trapped inside, but was rescued with relatively minor injuries. In the aftermath of the crash, investigators retraced the train's journey. 3.5 miles before the site of the crash, at around the point where Petra had begun to feel uneasy, investigators found a broken duo-block train wheel. Soon, the facts behind the derailment began to emerge. The steel tire of a wheel on the front car of the train had cracked and split, so that it was hanging off the wheel. The wheel continued down the track until it reached some points, where the tire caught in the rails and derailed the coach. Coaches further down the train had been pulled out of line, and as they approached the road bridge, they hit the bridge support. Then the whole bridge collapsed on top of the restaurant car, crushing it to a height of 6 inches. The rest of the train rammed into the wreckage. One of the duo-block wheels that had been specifically chosen to give a smoother ride had brought the train off the tracks. In the ultimate irony, it was the restaurant car, the start of all the problems, that had been most badly damaged. Germans began to question whether Deutsche Bahn could have prevented the accident. When they were considering the replacement wheels, had there been any clues that they might be potentially dangerous? Over the next few months, it emerged that a debate had been raging behind closed doors about the decision to insert duo-block wheels.
The worries that were voiced by our own experts were that the wheels were not sufficiently tested. Obviously, these weren't listened to properly, or at least Deutsche Bahn didn't react accordingly.
Deutsche Bahn needed a quick solution. Their problem was that the vibrating restaurant cars were getting a bad press. Bad publicity was damaging the company's reputation.
Above all, it was a matter of prestige. They wanted to prevent the train from continuing to suffer this poor image at all costs, and a solution was brought in very quickly.
It was this little tram that was to provide a clue to what had gone wrong at Eschede. It doesn't have very much in common with the ICE train. It trundles around the streets of Hanover in northern Germany at the breathtaking speed of 15 miles an hour. But what it does have in common is that it runs on the same type of wheels. And it had run into trouble. In July 1997, a year before the crash at Eschede, the wheels started cracking. Alarmed, the tram operators went to the German Health and Safety Agency, fearing a serious accident. Tests on the cracked wheels showed that metal fatigue was developing inside them. The Health and Safety Agency advised the tram operators that the wheels must be replaced sooner. Then the steel tires wouldn't have a chance to wear down, and metal fatigue wouldn't develop enough to form cracks. Delighted at having solved their problem, the tram operators contacted other rail operators around Germany, including Deutsche Bahn, to pass on this warning.
We get in contact with the Deutsche Bahn in autumn 1997. They told us that they are using dual-block wheels only in the restaurant cars, and they had no information about any problems, about cracks.
Deutsche Bahn didn't seem to appreciate the significance of what the tram operators told them. Once the vibration stopped, the prestige of their trains had been restored. Deutsche Bahn were happy, and there were plenty of passengers. Today, all the ICE trains run on their original wheels, but the track has been modified so that those wheels no longer make the train vibrate. 65 ICE trains still pass the bridge every day. Passengers can once again travel on the ICE at high speed, drinking champagne and watching their favorite films. But the disaster at Eschede has exposed the worthlessness of a state-of-the-art train without a commitment to safety to go with it.
I'm extremely angry with the railway, and I'm never travelling by train again, let alone ICE trains, because the confidence that I'd placed in the German railways has been totally destroyed.
Deutsche Bahn is still the subject of a major investigation into the accident at Eschede. The maglev is promoted as the train of the future because it is the fastest train in the world. Speed has always sold because it's what the passengers want, and railways have been keen to provide it. It's the only way this 19th century invention survived into the 20th century. But today's passengers want more. They want speed to go hand in hand with safety. Unless it does, the high-speed trains of tomorrow are simply heading for the buffers. Whenever we board a train, we put our life in a stranger's hands. How far should we trust the train driver? Sometimes our trust is misplaced. Every commuter's nightmare became reality in the morning rush hour of February the 28th, 1975, in the worst collision the London Underground has ever known. A crowded tube train was driven into a dead-end tunnel at nearly 40 miles an hour at Moorgate Station. 43 people were killed. Witnesses said the driver, 56-year-old Les Newson, stared straight ahead and accelerated just before impact. Suicide was not ruled out. But the driver's story was never heard. He was among the dead. Investigators say human error accounts for 4 out of 5 train disasters. They know where to start looking when trains crash. There is only one train driver whose name is known the world over. Almost a legendary figure, he inspired songwriters and movie makers, as well as generations of children.
Casey Jones was the astronaut of his day. Here was a vehicle, a powerful big black engine that could move down the rails at 80, 90, 100 miles an hour. And so it was the dream of every little boy to become a railroad engineer.
But perhaps Casey isn't the best role model.
Casey Jones did not like to be late. He had some incidences where he was going a little bit too fast through the yard, maybe slightly bumped another train here or there along the way.
Casey's memorial in Tennessee recalls his final fatal crash in April 1900. His fireman, Sim Webb, survived. His story of the most celebrated train wreck of all time contradicts the official version. Casey and Sim were speeding south through Mississippi. They'd been late leaving Memphis, but were making up time.
Sim Webb said that he feels confident they reached perhaps 100 miles an hour that evening. He was only 2 minutes behind schedule. There was 3 trains waiting ahead at a little community called Vaughn, Mississippi. They didn't know he was coming quite as quickly as he was coming. And Sim immediately turned to Casey and said,
"Oh, my Lord, here's something on the main line."
Casey began immediately blasting on his whistle to warn everyone ahead. And then he turned back to Sim and he said to Sim,
"Jump, Sim, jump." I grabbed the handrail, slid down as far as I could go, then turned loose.
He broke his arm in the jump and was knocked unconscious for a while. But Casey's engine, all 130 tons of it, crashed through the caboose, just splintered into a million pieces. A wood splinter actually went through his nose and out the back of his head. But he was the only one killed in the wreck. Casey Jones was a hero, staying at his post, trying his best to slow that train down before it crashed into the other one.
But who was to blame for the collision? Casey's bosses were in no doubt.
The official report, which is very straightforward, indicates that Casey Jones was at fault. But the exact terminology was that Engineer Jones was solely responsible for the accident for disregarding the signals of Flagman Newberry. The interesting thing about all this, though, is that Sim Webb, shortly after the accident, and for the rest of his life until his death in 1957, said that neither he nor Casey Jones ever saw the signals on the track. Without warning, we crashed into the other train. And so there you have the controversy, and there you have one of the pieces of the puzzle of the legend that we know today as Casey Jones.
How many drivers who crash their trains become national heroes? Nowadays, we're less forgiving. We need to know who's to blame when disaster strikes.
I'd heard people burning to death. It's the most horrible sound. You can't tell if it's a man or a woman screaming to death because they get that same high-pitched scream until suddenly it's cut off. And that sound will be with me as long as I live.
Martin Peterson has probably destroyed more trains than anyone alive today. In World War II, he flew 92 missions with RAF H for Harry Squadron, hunting down enemy troop and supply trains in France and Holland.
My job flying Typhoons was as a train buster, and I was officially credited with 26 trains destroyed. Now I know what it's like for the people who are on those trains, that I don't thought nothing of destroying during the war.
The past came back to haunt Martin Peterson just after sunrise on February the 8th, 1986. Canada's Via Rail long-distance sleeper train was making its way through the Rocky Mountains. Trains follow the same route today. They traveled all night from Vancouver on the west coast. By morning, sleeper train number 4 was amidst the pine forests of Alberta. As it passed through the small town of Hinton, the train was 6 minutes behind schedule. There was plenty of opportunity to make up the time with what should have been a clear line ahead of them. There were 115 passengers and crew aboard. Early risers were enjoying the view or looking forward to breakfast.
So I just sat down in the dining car. The waiter had just put a plate of bacon and eggs in front of me when sheets of steel hit this lady who was opposite me at the table and sliced her leg off.
Hello, dispatcher. Dispatcher? I saw a big explosion like a big fireball.
The train crew radioed news of the disaster.
The conductor from number 4 says he requires immediate, lots of ambulances and lots of doctors.
It was just unbelievable. Horrendous. Never seen anything like it in my life, and I hope I have never seen anything like that again. It's worse than war.
Okay, that's, have you got it there? I got it. You got it? Yeah. Good.
Doctors fought to save the injured. Many couldn't be saved. 23 people were killed. It took 3 days to recover all the bodies. Amid thousands of tons of wreckage, accident investigators couldn't afford to overlook the smallest clue.
When you go to a mishap such as this, there are certain things you look for. But in this case, it's a head-on, so obviously somebody ran a signal and piled into another train. From there, you go to computerized and mechanized records that are kept on train movements with the railway and start gleaning information from that.
Jones will cancel TOP number 138.
Data from the signal control room at Edmonton proved that the correct signals had been given. Why had they been ignored? Why had freight train 413 shot through a red stop signal just as the double track line merged to single track? At a point known as the Dalehurst Switch, the freight train raced onto the single track line with the passenger train rounding the bend ahead. "19 seconds later, they met head-on at a closing speed of 117 miles per hour. Examination of the freight train brakes brought a startling realization. The brakes were off. The engineman, the train driver, hadn't even tried to stop. But he couldn't explain why. 48-year-old Jack Hudson from Jasper, Alberta, was dead. To solve this mystery, investigators would have to inquire much more deeply. Near Jasper, bears come down to the railway tracks. They eat the grain which spills from passing freight cars. The railway's their meal ticket, as it is for many of the people in Jasper. It's a railway town. A freight depot and a crew base were established here when much of Canada was still unexplored wilderness. Even today, distances to cover are so vast that freight trains may be handled by a dozen or more crews in the course of a journey. Local crews are assigned a regular beat between freight depots taking a train over the same stretch of track, then turning around with another train, back and forth, day after day. Jack Hudson's beat went 106 miles from Jasper to a depot at Edson. There, on the morning of February the 8th, he was assigned Freight Train 413 with 2 crewmen. His assistant, known as the trainman, was Mark Edwards, age 25. The conductor, 33-year-old Wayne Smith. The engineman and his assistant sat beside one another in the cab, known as the head end. The conductor rode in the last car of the mile-long train. His job was to act as an extra pair of eyes and ears, to watch for signals as they were passed and report by radio to the crewmen in the cab. Even though they knew the route back to Jasper so well, it was no place for the crew of Freight Train 413 to relax.
It was probably the busiest stretch of track on the North American continent. It was like a dog's breakfast to the extent that there were slow trains, fast trains, long trains, short trains, and passenger trains. His total overall length was close to 6,000 feet. A heavy train and a long train.
The highest point between Edson and Jasper is known as Obed Summit.
It would be a long, tedious haul for that train because he's carrying 13,000 tons, which is almost full tonnage for the 3 units he's got. So he'd be traveling up there at 17, 18 to 20 miles an hour, jogging along. Very monotonous, half hour to 45 minutes. Nothing to do, be terrible.
They crawled towards Obed Summit, as they had so many times before. Suddenly, they were over the summit. Now, instead of hauling 13,000 tons slowly uphill, the huge load was pushing them faster and faster. They shot past a yellow warning signal telling them to slow down. They'd have to stop in the next few minutes to give way to the passenger train. Were the crew even aware they'd passed that warning signal?
If they were somewhere on a different planet because they didn't take any evasive action.
What might have put them on a different planet? Their work roster allowed just 6 hours break since their last shift.
The engineman had 5 hours sleep, the head-end trainman had 3.5 hours sleep, and the conductor had about 3 hours sleep. I'm of the opinion that the trainman was dozing. The engineman, he was found to have diabetes. He was plagued with pancreatitis. He'd had a colostomy. He was an alcoholic. And he had high blood pressure. Quite a conglomeration of illnesses. From where they located his remains, I think he was on his way down to the toilet, which is down in the nose of the cab.
Investigators believe the driver collapsed and may even have died as his assistant slept. But the train was equipped with a so-called dead man's pedal, which had to be pressed at all times. Here was a temptation for crews to break the rules.
Can you imagine sitting there with your foot holding down this pedal for 6 or 8 hours? They would use their lunch pail or overnight bag, or they'd get a brake shoe from the side of the track and just put it on that, and then they'd have no worry. It's being depressed, but it nullifies the safety effect of that device.
But even this explanation made no sense. The conductor, in the last car of the train, should have applied an emergency brake when the warning signal was passed and the train didn't slow down. Why didn't he? Conductor Wayne Smith survived the crash and gave testimony at a public inquiry. He denied any suggestion that he'd been asleep before the collision.
Do you appreciate that you're still under oath to tell the truth in these proceedings?
I do, my lord.
Thank you.
It didn't enter my mind that there was anything wrong on the head end or whatever. I tried to get a hold of the head end. I calling him on channel 1, and 3 or 4 times, there's no answer.
When he couldn't contact the head end, he should have set the emergency brake. And if he'd have done that, the collision would have been avoided for sure. His evidence is that he was trying to get him at the time, but nobody heard him. According to him, he was trying to get a hold of the head end. He was not asleep. That's his evidence.
The inquiry said it could not rely on the conductor's evidence. The rail company was blamed for letting a sick man like Jack Hudson take charge of a train and for working the crew without proper rest. This disaster led companies all over the world to overhaul their safety policies after an extraordinary series of experiments on train drivers themselves. Scientists were asked to determine why drivers make mistakes. The results were terrifying. A brief glimpse of a colored light is all that stands between a train driver and potential disaster. What every driver fears most has been given an unusual name, a SPAD. It means signal passed at danger. After the disaster at Hinton, Alberta, scientists were given an urgent task. Could they explain why SPADs occur? They made an extraordinary and chilling discovery. Train drivers are often asleep at the controls.
It was pretty scary when we realized that it was occurring sometimes in trains that were running up to 100 miles an hour or more. The train went half a mile down the track with the train driver at the controls totally unaware of his environment. Quite enough time to pass through a red signal during that period of time. When people are really trying to stay awake but are so sleep deprived that sleep intrudes, and then you're entering into what's called a microsleep. And the eyelids, when you're driving a car, might be closed for 5 seconds. Interestingly, when you're running a train, they're more often closed for something like 10 to 30 seconds in length.
Get you to hold that.
We wired up engineers with electrodes, measured the brain waves so that we could actually record every moment that they microsleeped or had a brief lapse while they were running a train. And the risk turned out to be around 5 to 10 seconds of microsleep, total inattention per hour of running the train.
The researchers widened their inquiry to Britain, where the worst accidents in recent years have been blamed on SPADs. The driver of a high-speed intercity train shot through a red light at Southall in West London in 1997. 7 people died. 2 years later, 31 people were killed when a driver passed a red signal near London's Paddington station. Incredibly, neither accident came as much of a surprise to the research team who had studied British drivers at work.
We saw almost as much fatigue in the British train operators as we'd seen in the North American counterpart. We studied train operating companies all around the country. There were a number of occasions when we're out on a stretch of track, coming up with a series of signal lights ahead of us, to turn to ask the driver a question and find that their head is bobbing and weaving and the eyelids are closing. It was certainly a scary moment for me personally. Somewhere between 10 and 25% of drivers would report this happened to them on a semi-regular basis. They'd had a SPAD because they'd had this momentary lapse of drowsiness.
Armed with data from Britain and Canada, scientists recommended less changeable shift patterns, rest periods, including brief naps between journeys in the train cab. earphones to keep out engine noise, an alarm to prevent dozing.
If I don't continually do something with these controls, like blow the whistle, ring the bell, or push the reset button, or move the throttle, if I don't do anything, if I'm unconscious or I'm sick, this will happen. And it'll get louder and louder, and when it activates, it sets the whole train brakes into this full brake stopping position to stop the train.
In Japan, railway operators believe they've hit on a simple way to stop drivers passing signals of danger. A way of keeping drivers awake and fully alert. The rules on Japanese railways say drivers and conductors must raise a finger, almost salute, each time they see a signal. Each time they start or stop the train.
He points out the signal in front of him. It is very important. And if he points out, he moves his fingers and also hands, and his eyes just can concentrate on the signal. So it is very important.
It seems to be working. Japanese railways are the safest in the world. Japan relies more heavily on its railway network than any other country. It has to run like clockwork.
If a train is delayed by 5 or 10 minutes, that's big news. But for an aeroplane, even if it's an hour late or if there's an accident, then people don't mind so much. They think, well, that's planes for you. Most train drivers feel a real obligation to be on time.
3 million people pass through Tokyo's main Shinjuku station every day. Japanese railways carry 10 times as many passengers as British railways. Being a train driver here is a demanding job, occasionally too demanding.
Every time I see reports of train accidents in the newspaper or on TV, I get goose pimples and start to tremble. I'd missed the train I meant to catch, and I was worried that I'd be late for work. I was able to get a seat. It's only a 4-minute journey, but I must have dozed off. Then, all of a sudden,
I was having breakfast when I heard an explosion. I rushed outside and saw that a train had crashed. 5 minutes later, I got a call from a newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun. They asked me to get some photos, but I said no. I'm rather squeamish. I don't like the sight of blood. But they insisted, so in the end I agreed. I loaded up my cameras and started snapping.
On December the 5th, 1988, directly below the photographer's balcony, Tokyo's first fatal train accident in 26 years. One train, heading away from the city center, had been unloading passengers at Higashi Nikano Station, when a second plowed into the back of it. With more than 3,000 passengers on both trains, the death toll could have been enormous.
The driver of the second train and one passenger were killed. Many were injured. Because the driver was killed, it wasn't apparent what had caused the accident.
Japan's safety record is partly due to advanced automatic warning systems. But this accident showed how the pressure of the timetable can override safety.
The train was equipped with a safety device called ATS, automatic train stopping. An alarm sounds and the train stops automatically before it reaches a red signal, unless the driver overrides the system. When this accident happened, the trains were running late. It was common practice for drivers to override the alarm system. For some reason, the driver overrode the alarm, but he didn't brake manually and crashed into the other train. Perhaps he had a heart attack, as some people have said.
But perhaps the driver wasn't blameless after all.
Police found a radio in the driver's cab, and it was switched on. If the driver was listening to the radio, his attention may have been distracted, so he forgot that he'd cancelled the alarm system.
When the accident happened, Japan Railways already had plans to install a new system called ATSP, which can't be overridden by drivers. The deaths came as a huge shock to company bosses.
We just rush into the investment and to develop the ATSP. And also, we established safety training center, so we have done everything.
Training on simulators is part of the new safety regime established after the accident at Higashi Nikano. Training which provides a stark warning of what can go wrong. New drivers spend 6 months at the center before they're allowed to take the controls of a train. Experienced drivers are given safety lessons too, a minimum of 2 hours a month. Japanese railways have put their faith in a unique blend of new technology and old-fashioned common sense. The need for vigilance is drummed into the drivers, even when they're not in the cab of a train. It's a company rule that drivers have to point right, then left, each time they cross the railway tracks, to make sure they don't get run down by a passing train. A driver can be fully vigilant and still pass a red light. What if he swears later that it wasn't red at all?
During the interviews with the locomotive engineer, he didn't feel like that he had done anything wrong, but what he did resulted in a catastrophic accident. And he was concerned that he would be held responsible for it or blamed for it.
After this crash, investigators coined a new term, the phantom signal. The rail yards at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, one of the nerve centers for freight traffic in the Northeast United States. Dozens of huge trains are dispatched from here each day. 2 or more locomotives dragging upwards of 150 freight cars behind them. But once a train has picked up speed, it can take more than a mile to bring it to a stop. Signals are spaced far apart, with these stopping distances in mind. On September the 29th, 1997, this signal was set to warn of a train which had stopped 2 miles ahead. But the signal was ignored by freight train PIB 8.
Well, when PIB 8 came around the bend, of course he was on the other track. He expected the track ahead to be clear. There were 5 light engines stopped here in front of the home board. The engineer cried out, "Train ahead," and threw his train into emergency. By the time he put his train in emergency and the brakes to apply, there wasn't very much time at all.
Freight cars spilled thousands of tons of grain across the tracks.
Massive compression forces catapulted them off the track like dominoes falling, and they were back and forth across the rail into a pile of about 15 cars.
The conductor of train PIB 8 was killed, but the driver survived. Tests showed that signal 1061E had been programmed to display red. The driver's story seemed unbelievable.
He perceived it as a yellow over green. So we were very surprised because we were believing that, hey, he doesn't really know what he's talking about.
It could have been put down to a tragic human error, but investigators didn't close the file. Something about signal 1061E bothered them. They ordered another train to run the route to test the driver's story. They perched outside the train cab and watched intently.
As we got closer, it was amazing. You were seeing flashes of green and flashes of yellow into a signal that should not show green or yellow at all.
The driver had been telling the truth. But how could a red signal shine yellow or green?
Now, at the time of the accident, the sun was low in the horizon, and that glare from the outer white lenses made reading that signal nearly impossible. Compounding the problem, the lower signal had rust deposits inside between the outer and inner lens. That rust probably was caused by water filling and draining over a period of a year, 2 years. That rust, when the sun shined onto the lens, turned from red to yellow.
On Conrail alone, after this accident, they looked at 9,556 signals and found 55 that were defective. They changed the mastic that they used to seal the signal lights to ensure that they don't have any leakage of water in them. That's the way that they go about preventing phantom signals.
Faulty signals or a sleeping crew explain why some trains crash. But can anything protect against a driver who's truly homicidal? So dangerous that he's later charged with murder.
If you're going at the speed that I was going, it just ain't gonna stop.
The driver is the most vulnerable person in a train crash. Drivers rarely survive a disaster. If they do survive, they've got some explaining to do. Since he killed 5 passengers, this driver's been in fear for his own life.
People come up to me and say things like, my mother could have been on that train. A guy had threatened to kill me. I said, well, if you want to kill me, go right ahead. You know, if any of your family was on the train, then please forgive me. I am very sorry.
Robert Ray crashed his New York subway train and faced 5 charges of second-degree murder. He admits he made a mistake, but says the investigators did too. So what exactly happened on Robert Ray's terrible last ride? In the city which never sleeps, It's the subways which 24 hours a day pump adrenaline round the system. These trains cover almost 1 million miles a day, carrying 4 million passengers. Accidents are rare. The one which put Robert Ray behind bars in 1991 was the worst in 63 years. His journey began at Woodlawn in the Bronx at 11:30 at night. Route number 106 through Manhattan, destination Brooklyn. A run which Robert Ray had been making every night in his 2 years as a subway driver, a motorman.
It was just a day like any other day. By the time I got up to go to work, I was rushing. I was kind of tired because I didn't get that much sleep. And I got on, I checked all the signals, make sure everything was in order, did my running brake tests, and I started functioning.
Robert Ray had been late reporting for work. The Brooklyn Express had left 6 minutes behind schedule. The motorman decided to make up time as he headed downtown. 125 passengers were on board the speeding train.
I was running a little bit ahead of schedule now because I was thinking about running behind schedule, but then I picked up speed. The last station I seen was 28th Street, and I remember saying to myself that it's kind of hot. Somehow I just blacked out. I looked around, it was cloudy, smoke all over the place, and I was like, what the heck happened? So I said, man, I must have had an accident or something. The whole side of the train was gone. I opened the cab door, and I seen a couple of bodies like in a sitting position, sort of like where I'm now. From then on, I went into like a state of shock.
The express had derailed just before Union Square Station. Rescuers' first concern was to free the injured. The scale of the disaster unfolded as 5 bodies were recovered. But one person was still unaccounted for.
If the operator survives the event itself, you would normally expect him to remain on scene. So they began to look for him. They began looking in the wreckage, under the wreckage.
The mayor of New York visited the scene in the early hours of the morning. Then he made a startling announcement.
The motorman of the train is missing, and the police and transit are checking hospitals in an effort to locate him.
There is still one person.
The search went on all night, but concern turned to suspicion. By dawn, police had staked out Robert Ray's apartment here in the Bronx. The motorman was arrested as he walked up to the building.
The unmarked car came and 2 guys got out. My brother said, there's Robert right there. And I turned around and here's my brother coming to me and he told me, he says, Rob, you know what happened? He said, you had an accident, and 5 people died. They heard it over the radio and they didn't know where the motorman was. Excuse me. And I went to the station house. And they asked me a whole bunch of questions and questions on top of questions. And, all I remember was saying that I was tired. I want to go home, I want to go home. And you're not going home, you're not going home. And finally, one cop says to the other cop, "Hey, that's it, I'm leaving. You know, you talk to him. Maybe you can talk some sense into him. You know, we're not getting any answers."
Police, and investigators too, were looking for answers to explain a bizarre chain of events.
In the chaos of such a rescue, who's the operator and who's not the operator kind of goes by the wayside. He just left the subway tunnel and went up above. And there's a park, and he sat in the park and he watched the emergency response. You can let your mind begin to wander as to why.
I was losing air, I was like feeling like I was gonna pass out again. So I went out to the street, and then I started feeling a little better. I realized that I had to go out and get something to drink because I wanted to cloud all this that I just seen, you know. I tried to just block everything out, and then I went and I got another beer. I don't know how many beers I had. I just wanted to just drink myself to a stupor at that time.
So had he blacked out, then drunk to steady his nerves after the crash? Or was he drunk before the journey even began?
The first station he came to, he overshot by 5 cars. That means that you can't open the doors, obviously, because he'd let passengers out into the tunnel. It was only a 10-car train, so he was off by that much. Half an hour into his trip, there was a general work order that required him to go from an express line to a local line. He's expected to go about 10 miles an hour. 35 to 55 is the speed he was actually doing.
On board, passengers had sensed that the driver was not in full control.
I said, look, I'm getting scared. I tried looking for something to brace myself. And then I just thought, silly me, it won't happen, you know. And then it did happen.
The survivor's first response was to blame the driver.
When I saw him come out, open the door, I wasn't the only one who swore at him, you know. And he just seemed to, he even stepped over a lady, an helpless lady. The guy just seemed out of it. He was not connected with us at all.
Was he suffering from shock immediately after the collision? Would that satisfy the NYPD?
He looked at the paper and he read it. And then he says, "Aren't you missing something here?" I says, "What are you saying?" "Well, admit you're an alcoholic. I mean, you're drunk, you crashed the train. I mean, just admit it, you know?" And I was like, all right, give me the paper. I need help, I'm an alcoholic. He said, "Oh, we got our man." And that's when he went and he left.
The driver later retracted his statement. But investigators were sure they'd found the cause of this disaster.
You provided the police with indications of how much Scotch whiskey he had had the day before. In his statement to the police, he indicated that he was an alcoholic, and that fits the blood alcohol content that we derived. Metabolism rates are different for people who are frequent drinkers and those that are infrequent drinkers. It took nearly 13 hours to get a blood sample, and so we did some calculations. We believe that his blood alcohol at the time of the accident was somewhere between 0.29 and 0.36, 3 times over the limit. These are numbers that would typically make someone comatose. May well be enough to kill a younger person, someone who's not used to alcohol. And so that gives you a sense of how much alcohol we're talking about.
And I realize now, if I would have stayed there, they would have grabbed me. They would have just realized that he just had a blackout. He was totally sober.
The blood tests and witness statements were enough to mount a damning case. But would the driver accept the blame?
My lawyer offered me a plea bargain of 5 to 15, and I decided I'm not going to cop out. I want to take it to trial. He says, "You sure you want to take it to trial?" He says, "Well, you know, they can give you 25 to life." And I said, "Well, if God wants me to do the 25 years to life, then I'll do the 25 years to life."
Robert Ray was charged with 5 counts of murder. The district attorney said he'd shown depraved indifference to his passengers' safety.
When the jury convicted me, they believed that I was drunk because of the press boosted up so high, but they didn't believe I was a depraved person, which I'm not.
The court accepted that he hadn't intended to kill, but should still serve 5 to 15 years. Years in which he's continued to protest his innocence.
I've cried so much, my tears are of joy now, knowing that I've lived through this, to see another day and to give the people the answers that, not that they want, but that they need to hear.
Investigators always hope a driver's story will unlock the puzzle of why trains crash. This time, the story itself was the puzzle. The driver either a liar or a victim himself. After this disaster, the New York subway began testing drivers for alcohol and drug abuse. A recognition that, as always in rail travel, the safety of hundreds of people falls on just one person's shoulders. It's a frightening thought as our train speeds on. But in any system under human control, we'll always pay the price of human error. When trains crash, we tend to blame the rail operators. Mechanical failure and driver error are the usual suspects when we ask what went wrong. But increasingly, train safety is threatened by forces outside the control of the rail operators. According to regulators, unless they can be stopped, disaster must surely follow. Wemyss Bay on the west coast of Scotland. It's served by a rail line connecting it to Glasgow. The line has been in operation for over 100 years and used to be one of the safest stretches of track in Britain. That was until one evening in 1994. A young couple, soon to be married, said their goodbyes. Two teenage girls were on their way to a night out on the town. A man headed home after a family visit. It was the last Saturday night train to Glasgow, but it would never arrive. nor would two of the people on it. Travelling on board was ticket collector Brian Maguire. Just a typical late-night train journey.
All the tickets had been done in the back two carriages. The only carriage that now remained was the front carriage, where I'm certain there was only one passenger on. I made my way through the gangway to access this front carriage. I noticed that this passenger was sitting all the way down to the front. For about 10 seconds, I paused here. For some reason, I decided not to take his ticket that night and removed myself from the front carriage back into the middle.
Moments later, the train left the tracks and ploughed into a bridge at full speed. 21-year-old Alan Nichol, who was soon to be married, was killed instantly. It was his ticket Brian Maguire decided not to collect. Also killed was train driver Arthur McKee, the father of two children. A derailment on a railway line with an untarnished safety record. What could have gone wrong?
Can confirm that the train did strike the bridge.
But you've no idea why?
At this point, I cannot confirm why that has occurred.
The vital clues were to be put together by John Malcolm, then a police inspector at Greenock Police Station.
Like any incident in any scene, I chose to make an examination of the area of the track which led up to the bridge, which is where the first point of impact was. And in pursuit of that, I walked on the line back down the direction the train had come. And at that time I found some 100 yards away from the bridge debris of concrete blocks on the railway line, which led me to think that something had been on the line when the train had passed over.
The debris John Malcolm found matched the concrete slabs bordering the railway line. Someone had lifted them onto the tracks.
From then forward, we approached the crash as a crime, and the fact that the deaths of the driver and the passenger, as a result of that, had been murdered.
Scotland's railway system is no stranger to vandalism, but the millions of pounds a year they spend on fencing wasn't enough to keep the culprits off the tracks. The concrete slabs had been stacked in piles at 3 different locations. Such a calculated act suggested they were aiming to cause a serious accident. Who were these dangerous criminals? Where to start looking?
The exact scene on the track where this happens is a very private place. It's below road level. It's at night. Not in a place where anybody walking past in the road above would be able to see what was happening. So, in essence, the act in itself was done in private. So a very difficult task lay ahead in identifying who was in that area at that time of night.
Secluded though the spot was, it was just possible somebody had seen something suspicious.
A £10,000 reward has now been put up by ScotRail and Railtrack.
To get the maximum response possible, the fiancé of the passenger who had died was persuaded to make a public appeal.
If they know something, please come forward. We've got to find out who it was. It's never going to bring Alan back, but at least if they catch someone, it might stop them doing it again to someone else.
From information that came in response to appeals, a picture built up where people had been seen moving about the area, generally teenagers or youngsters, and it became apparent as the days passed that they had not come forward in response to these appeals.
A housing estate next to the stretch of track where the derailment happened. Somewhere here, the investigators thought they would find the teenagers they were looking for. Door-to-door inquiries soon established there were only 16 teenagers who could have been in the area on the night of the crash. All 16 were brought in for questioning.
2 girls gave statements which included information that they'd been in the company of 2 boys
at the time when this train was at Wemyss, who had gone onto the railway line, and when they came off, although the girls hadn't seen what they'd done on the railway line, a comment from one of them immediately was, wait till you see what happens, a train will crash.
1 week after the crash that claimed 2 lives, 2 teenage boys were charged with murder. Gary Dugan and Craig Houston were sentenced to 15 years each for culpable homicide, which, one step down from murder, acknowledges they did not mean to kill.
A fatal train crash by placing concrete blocks on a railway line near their homes in Greenock on June the 25th. That resulted in the derailment of the Wemyss to Glasgow.
What happened in Greenock highlights the vulnerable position rail operators find themselves in. More than any other form of transport, rail is an extremely attractive target for the vandal. The 2 youngsters responsible for the disaster are typical of vandals generally. Most are teenage boys who psychologists say are naturally drawn to the railways as a target for their adolescent aggression.
The Greenock case really typifies everything there is to say about young men and crime. Young men, particularly boys, like to be rebellious, and they like to be rebellious in a way which puts 2 fingers up to the establishment. And of course the railways are seen by boys as being part of the establishment, and boys love machinery. And what do railways provide? Machinery owned by the establishment, which travels at a fast speed, and it's accessible.
Vandalism causes nearly 2/3 of British train accidents. It cost the rail authorities more than £26 million a year. Most worrying of all is that the vandals simply don't realise the consequences of their actions.
The Greenock case is a perfect example of a situation which is ideal for young boys to not display what we call impulse control. It was at night. They were with 2 girls who they wanted to impress. In addition to that, they were at an age and of a gender that wants to rebel. And boys of that disposition don't fully realize that if the train crashes, that there are people within the train who are going to be injured. And those simple facts often don't come to the fore when boys are in that situation feeling those sorts of things.
But rail's vulnerability is not limited to the actions of naive teenagers. The tracks are also open to attack from those who are all too aware of the mayhem they can cause. In October of 1995, the southwest corner of the Arizona desert was the scene of a deliberate derailment. One that could have brought the worst train crash in American history. Here, with thousands of miles of track running through very remote areas, the railroad is literally wide open. Amtrak's Sunset Limited passenger train from Miami was passing through Arizona on its 65-hour journey to Los Angeles. Traveling on board, fast asleep in the middle of the night, was Neil Halford.
About 1:30, I woke up, and the first thing, of course, you hear is the brakes screaming on the train, and very rapidly coming to a stop, and then boom, just a very solid hit.
Traveling at speed, the train derailed as it crossed a bridge. 3 of its carriages plunged 30 feet into a dried-out riverbed. It could hardly have been a worse place for an accident, in the middle of a snake-infested desert, 3 miles from the nearest road. It took 45 minutes for help to arrive.
It was the first time as the sheriff, or my 38 years in law enforcement, that I saw something like this. This was sort of a shock, because you only see this type of thing on television, in movies.
The passengers stayed cooped up on the wrecked train, afraid to get off because of rattlesnakes. But Neil Halford decided to risk it.
I decided to go outside, and I'm walking around, and at one point I look over and I saw this piece of paper under a rock. I kind of walked past it at first, and then the little wheels start clicking in my head saying, well, we're a long way from anywhere. And I go, that's really odd that this piece of paper should be lying out here in the middle of nowhere. And then I started skimming the note real quick, and I saw ATF, FBI, and then I just realized, oh my God, this was a terrorist attack. What was a train accident a few moments earlier, or just, an accident, and it went from being that to someone has just tried to kill every single last person on this train.
What he had found was a cryptic message signed by a group calling themselves Sons of the Gestapo. It referred to the siege at Waco, Texas, where members of an extremist group had been killed in a shootout with the FBI. It began to look as if the derailment was a revenge terrorist attack. It was a frightening possibility. 6 months before, another revenge attack, the Oklahoma City bombing, had claimed 167 lives. This latest attack in the desert had the nation up in arms.
I am determined that we will make sure that in the United States we will have the tools, the means we need to keep the American people safe.
Today, the FBI sealed off a 1 square mile area around the site of the Amtrak crash. The number of agents here second only to the Oklahoma City bombing.
1 person had been killed and 76 injured. But that was more by luck than by judgment. The saboteurs had been going for maximum damage.
This is the point where the derailment itself occurred. And at this juncture right here, these bolts were loosened and removed, allowing these 2 plates to fall away. That effectively loosened this left rail. They were able to push it inward approximately 12 inches to about there.
The saboteurs circumvented the safety system, which is designed to warn drivers of problems with the track ahead. Any break in the rail interrupts an electrical circuit running along the track and changes the signals to red. But the saboteurs wired around their work, keeping the circuit open and making sure the Amtrak Sunset Limited approached the break in the track on a green light. When the Sunset Limited met the broken track in the desert, it was sheer luck that the locomotive somehow managed to keep going and get to the other side of the bridge. Remarkably, only 3 of the train's carriages fell into the dried-out riverbed below. Tampering with the rails only 200 feet from a bridge, the saboteurs seem to have been planning a dramatic rerun of the worst rail accident North America had ever seen. 2 years earlier, the same train had derailed on a bridge as it passed through Alabama. Its front locomotive plunged into the river below, pulling the rest of the train with it, killing 47 people. Who were the Sons of the Gestapo? The obvious lead was the note. A clue to the identity of its author came from an eyewitness who had surveyed the scene of the crime from an unusual angle. Matthew Irwin had taken a flight over the desert at 8:30 on the evening before the derailment. His brother-in-law had needed to get some more flying time to add to his pilot's license. Flying over the Palo Verde nuclear power station, just 2 miles from the site of the derailment, they noticed something unusual down below.
As we were going across atop the power plant and banking to turn around and come back is when I spotted some lights out in the desert. I knew there was no residence out that far, as there's not much out there.
His account of what he had seen narrowed down the time frame for when the rails had been tampered with.
We had an indicator that it was highly possible that the derailment itself, the tampering with the tracks, had occurred late Sunday evening, perhaps 3 to 4 hours before the train derailed.
Taking their investigation into the remote desert community, the FBI began to ask local residents about the night of the crash. A local farmer had come forward to say someone had cut his fence and driven a vehicle through, leaving distinct tire tracks. But then the trail turned cold. The locals showed an irritating reluctance to cooperate with the federal authorities. Somewhere out in the desert, someone knew more about the broken fence than they were letting on.
The people in this part of the country believe strongly in the credo of minding your own business. And in the same light, don't really want to have a lot of interaction with society as a whole or law enforcement. We pursued exhaustive leads, put a great deal of research into trying to get more information, and it did not bear fruit. We were not able to take it any further beyond the vague descriptions that we were successful in obtaining.
5 years later, the FBI is no closer to solving the crime. The authorities now suspect that the sons of the Gestapo never existed, that they were invented to conceal a crime, a plan to wreck and then rob a freight train. It was a crime reminiscent of the bad old days of the Wild West, but one that was about to be repeated 6,000 miles away in the crowded railways of a modern European city. On November the 20th, 1998, someone started to write threatening letters to the German rail operator, Deutsche Bahn. He demanded the railway hand over the equivalent of £3 million in Deutschmarks. Otherwise, passengers would die. The author claimed to represent former railway employees made redundant by the company. Assuming it was the work of a harmless crank, Deutsche Bahn chose to ignore the letter. But this man was not as harmless as they thought. A week later, he sent a second letter, and still hearing nothing from Deutsche Bahn, the blackmailer took action. Choosing a section of track in the town of Wilmersdorf, he loosened one of the rails. Fortunately for Deutsche Bahn, the loose rail was spotted and repaired before any train passed over it. At Deutsche Bahn headquarters, no connection was made with the blackmailer. Writing increasingly aggressive letters, the blackmailer threatened a major rail disaster in the Berlin region if Deutsche Bahn still failed to respond. To show its willingness to pay up, the railway considered placing an advert in a Berlin newspaper. 5 days later, Deutsche Bahn, struck by the unusual persistence of the letters, decided to take no chances and placed the ad. But to avoid bad publicity, they tried to conceal what was going on by making it look like an ordinary promotion. They were too clever for their own good. So obscure was the telephone number that the blackmailer didn't notice it. Deutsche Bahn's strategy had backfired. Frustrated by their apparent silence, he decided to go for the railway's high-profile intercity express service known as the Ice Train. He chose the town of Uxspringe, 90 miles west of Berlin, where the ice train passes through at 125 miles per hour. Under cover of darkness, he lifted one of the rails 10 centimeters off the ground. His tampering would cause the train literally to take off when it hit the raised section of track. It didn't work out as planned. All the driver felt was a slight bump. The train took off, but miraculously found the rail when it came back down again. It was the luckiest of escapes. But even though there had been no derailment, targeting the ice service was the one sure way to get Deutsche Bahn's attention. 6 months before, the German public had been woken up to the consequences of a high-speed train crash. An ice train had derailed in the town of Eschede when one of its wheels had broken. The train had ploughed into a road bridge at over 120 miles an hour, killing 101 people. For Deutsche Bahn, it was a public relations disaster.
The Eschede disaster was the writing on the wall for Deutsche Bahn. Any attack on this high-speed train or on its tracks is especially dangerous, and for the rail company and the public, it's a sensitive issue. This is how it was in the Uxspringer case. The German rail company could on no account accept a high-speed train being hit by an attacker in this way.
The blackmailer meant business, and Deutsche Bahn didn't know where to look.
An emergency staff was put into action as is customary in these circumstances. You must bear in mind that as soon as it became obvious how serious the threats were, new attacks had to be expected every day. Nobody knew how many people were involved, in what way, or in what place they would strike next.
Faced with the task of policing a huge rail network, they focused their efforts on the high-speed lines. The German Air Force flew reconnaissance missions, looking for signs of the blackmailer. Unaware that Deutsche Bahn were placing further adverts to try and make contact, the blackmailer struck again, this time choosing the line running through the town of Anklam. He made sure he would have a derailment this time. A freight train traveling north was derailed in spectacular fashion. The driver was lucky to survive. It could have been much worse. A high-speed passenger train had been due to pass the site of the derailment. If it hadn't been delayed by half an hour, it would have run straight into the wreckage. Deutsche Bahn now had no choice. They announced to the nation that the derailment had been an act of sabotage and made an appeal to the blackmailer to get in touch. By now it was December the 10th, and Germany was preparing for Christmas.
Many people were considering travelling by train in order to avoid the Christmas rush and sitting in traffic jams. The blackmail attempt and the derailed train acted like a bomb under the general public, especially as Deutsche Bahn went public immediately and said, yes, we are being blackmailed.
Desperate to make contact with the blackmailer before he struck again, Deutsche Bahn issued a telephone number and appealed for him to phone in. The risk was the publicity would drive the blackmailer further underground. The risk paid off. He had been watching the television and called in later that evening. Having put the German nation into a state of panic, would he now succeed in his bid to extort a ransom? The man he spoke to at Deutsche Bahn was not an employee of the railway, but a police officer specially trained in the psychology of negotiation.
A CID officer from the Federal Criminal Investigation Office conducted the phone calls with the attacker and proceeded in such a manner to strike up a bond of trust. He said to the saboteur immediately, "We shall deal with your demands fully," thus persuading him not to carry out any more attacks on the rail network under any circumstances.
The police officer's strategy was to befriend the blackmailer, to get him to reveal details about himself that would allow the police to track him down and make an arrest. All this took time, and meanwhile Deutsche Bahn was losing money.
The level of media response that went with it, headlines all over Germany, caused a lot of confusion and uncertainty amongst the population. Because of the serious nature of this attack and of this blackmail attempt, many people made alternative arrangements. They just didn't go by train.
48 hours after he had first called, the blackmailer agreed to a rendezvous to collect 10 million Deutschmarks. He told police he would be coming alone and would not be carrying a weapon. The police had done everything they could. They now had to have faith in their strategy and go in for an arrest. The money was to be handed over at a petrol station in Bavaria. An undercover police officer drove in a black Mercedes to deliver the cash. It had been agreed the driver would sit in the car and wait for the blackmailer to approach. The money was to be in a briefcase in the boot. He walked straight into the trap. The blackmailer had his hands on the money for only a few seconds before he was arrested. Klaus-Peter Sabota was naive enough to believe there would be no police present at the rendezvous. He was charged with attempted murder and extortion. 1 year later, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Sabota had shown how easy it is for one man to destabilize an entire network simply by targeting its highest profile service. As railways across the world seek to heighten their appeal with high-speed trains, rail will become a more and more attractive target for attack. Interference from vandals and criminals costs the railways millions of pounds a year and causes enormous inconvenience for the travelling public. So far, they have had only a small impact on the number of train fatalities. But there is another form of outside intervention, usually totally innocent, which has claimed thousands of lives.
The 933 from Bridlington to Hull was packed with holidaymakers when it approached the level crossing at anything up to 70 miles an hour. The entire train was derailed, one carriage spinning right round, another ending on its side. More than 50 firemen, backed up by soldiers, pulled out the dead and injured.
In the village of Lockington on Humberside in 1986, a demonstration of the dangers of mixing road and rail. A van failed to stop at the level crossing and was cut in two by the approaching train from Bridlington to Hull. But the van's wheel axle lifted the locomotive off the tracks and derailed the train. 8 of the train's passengers were killed as the carriages were thrown into the fields beside the track. Since 1988, there have been 449 accidents at level crossings in Britain, claiming 136 lives. It's a problem railways all over the world must face when train and motor vehicle compete for the same space. With over 200,000 level crossings, the United States has the worst accident rate in the world. Set up a video camera at the typical American level crossing, and it makes remarkable viewing indeed. Dr. Stephen Richards has spent a lifetime studying the level crossing and the curious part it plays in traffic accidents.
I've witnessed crossings where you'll literally have up to 80 or 90% of the motorists who arrive at the crossing drive around the lowered gate arms. I've seen school buses, I've seen emergency vehicles, I've seen transit bus operators, as well as the general public, large truck drivers, all take it upon themselves to drive around lowered gate arms.
Motorists exhibit extraordinary impatience when it comes to waiting at level crossings. Research shows that there is a critical threshold of tolerance a motorist can bear, which once breached, encourages the driver to take huge risks. Anything more than half a minute is extremely dangerous.
30 seconds is really quite a bit of a long time to the motorist. If you compare that to stop time at an intersection for a highway traffic signal, to other types of driving situations, 30 seconds is a reasonably long time. And again, I think you can probably tolerate another 10, maybe another 20 seconds, but once that warning time starts to push 50, 60 seconds, and certainly beyond a minute, you almost see a wholesale exodus of motorists from that stop line at the crossing.
To make matters worse, motorists are handicapped by the limitations of human perception when they look to see if it is safe to drive over a crossing. If they see a train coming, it's extremely difficult for them to judge just how long they've got. The human brain is an excellent judge of speed and direction when dealing with movement at close range. Most humans will easily catch a ball thrown at close quarters and at high speed. But for objects further away, they are easily misled. Scientists have found that the accuracy with which the human brain can judge when an approaching object will arrive depends upon the size of the image of that object on the retina of the human eye. The brain's processes work perfectly on a basketball court. But with a fast-moving train, by the time it's close enough to make an accurate calculation, it's simply too late.
You can do the calculation on the size of that locomotive, let's say, viewed end-on on your retina, and you find that it would be on the order of the size of your thumbnail when it was approximately 100 meters away. At that distance, if it were traveling at 78 miles an hour, it would only take about 2.5 seconds before it hit me. Now that's a figure that is enough time for me as a human being standing on the tracks to jump off to either side. It's quite enough time for that. It's not enough time to take a vehicle that is either at rest or moving very slowly necessarily and get it fully across the tracks.
Whilst the vast majority of accidents are caused by errors of judgment by the motorist, keeping crossings safe depends on precise coordination of road and rail signalling. Get this wrong by only a matter of seconds, and the consequences can be dreadful. For over 100 years, the small commuter town of Fox River Grove in the northwest suburbs of Chicago has had a harmonious relationship with the railway. Cutting the village in two, the tracks have carried commuters in and out of Chicago, bringing wealth and prosperity to the area. When the highway that ran alongside the tracks was widened in 1990, the distance between it and the railroad became shorter. Now there was only room for 2 cars. More than that, and they would have to queue up on the tracks, waiting for the traffic lights to change, allowing them onto the highway. As a safety precaution, the traffic lights were programmed to turn green whenever a train was approaching, so any cars waiting on the tracks could get out of the way in time. But in 1994, complaints began to emerge about malfunctions in the system. Michael Kunz was the first to notice the problem when on a routine trip to the drive-through bank, he saw something highly unusual at the level crossing across the street.
I saw a car sitting on the railroad tracks and the gates had come down, and the guy was blocked in. My first thought was that the guy's gonna get hit because he's sitting on the tracks. And you know, you feel helpless watching this. And I was like, he's gotta move, he's gotta get out of the way.
What Mike Kunz witnessed was a serious failure in the safety mechanism. The car he saw was waiting for the lights to change. But as the train approached, the system failed to turn the traffic lights green, trapping the car on the tracks.
pulled off and got out of the way just in time because, and the train came, and it was, then all of a sudden I could see that the light turned green after the train had crossed the intersection.
Having reported the malfunction, Mike Kunz was surprised when 1 week later he saw the engineer's maintenance report.
They had come back and checked their signal, and they came back and said everything's working fine. And I just found that hard to believe that, after I'd seen this, that everything was working fine.
But that wasn't the only time he saw irregularities at the town's level crossings. As part of his duties as a volunteer firefighter, Mike Kunz often found himself outside the town's fire station, waiting for the crews to return. Having seen the original malfunction at Lincoln Avenue, he then saw the same thing happen again at the adjacent crossing on Algonquin Road.
I was thinking the whole time that Lincoln Avenue was the problem, and I just witnessed the same thing at Algonquin Road, just by standing out in front of the firehouse and seeing it.
In the year that followed, Mike Kunz filed a total of 7 complaints about signal malfunction at the town's level crossings. Engineers were called out to check, but for some reason they couldn't find the problem.
Either the railroad were contacted first, or the highway department first, and vice versa, and the same thing, they came out, everything's working the way it's supposed to, and now this is screwed up, there's something wrong, and these guys, I don't know what they're checking, but they're not checking to see that this light is not changing when it's supposed to. I had made a comment while I was at the firehouse that there's going to be a big accident.
In the month that followed, more complaints came in, and again, engineers failed to detect any problem at the town's crossings. Meanwhile, the community of Fox River Grove went about its business, unaware that concerns had been raised. But on the morning of October the 25th, 1995, a school bus carrying 35 high school students rolled over the crossing and stopped at the red light on the other side. It had its rear end hanging 3 feet over the tracks. An express train, known as the Flyer, roared towards the crossing at 70 miles an hour.
The light started flashing. I looked to my left and realized that it was the Flyer, and I looked at the kids and I said, "Oh my God, it's the Flyer."
The bus driver was oblivious to the fact the rear of her bus was overhanging the track.
We looked as it was to the left, and it was getting closer, and we were in the car. We started screaming for the bus to go, and looking at the kids, we could see the kids in the bus. The light for her to turn to the left was still red, and with that, within a few seconds, bam, the train came through, smacked the bus, and from my vantage point, I never saw the light turn green.
A frantic rescue effort started just minutes after a commuter train heading for Chicago crashed into a school bus. Just after 7 o'clock this morning, the bus was stopped at a red light, its tail end sitting on the tracks while the driver waited.
7 of the children were killed.
I was at work, and I happened to be listening to a radio. I was sitting at a desk, and they broke over the radio and said that if you're in the area of Algonquin Road and Northwest Highway, to avoid it because a school bus had been hit by a train. And they didn't say what town at first. And God, when I heard that, it had to be us.
The nightmare had come true. Mike knew that his 14-year-old daughter would be on the school bus that reached the crossing at exactly this time.
I called the firehouse, and this one, Angie, answered the phone. All I said was, "Angie, how bad is it?" And she goes, "It's real bad. It's real bad." And I go, "Whose bus is it? Whose bus is it?" She goes, "The high school bus." I says, "Do you know if Michelle, my daughter, do you know if Michelle's is okay?" She goes, "I don't know. I don't know anybody. I don't know. I can't tell. I can't tell you." I had just hung up, and this friend of ours, this Susie, she called me, and she told me, "I just want to let you know Michelle is okay." And I said, "Well, where was she on the bus? Was it her bus?" And she goes, "Well, she wasn't on the bus. It was her bus, but she wasn't on the bus." And I said, "What happened?" She goes, "Well, she had an orthodontist appointment." All of a sudden, I'm like, "Oh my God, that's right. She had an orthodontist appointment at 8 o'clock in the morning. That's why she wasn't on there." And I was, you like, thank God,
Attention focused on the actions of the bus driver, who remarkably had survived the accident unhurt. On the day of the accident, she had been filling in for a sick colleague. She had never driven the route before. Nevertheless, she should have realized there was not enough space to fit her bus on the other side of the crossing. She should have stopped short of the tracks.
Federal safety investigators have found several problems with the timing of the gates and the lights that may have contributed to the crash. One of the first people to identify the problem, Mike Coons, says he reported his concerns to the State Department of Transportation 2 years ago, but no action was ever taken.
Unfortunate, 7 Lines had to bring this up, and that's the unfortunate thing about it. Very saddened about it.
Mike Coons' story mystified the National Transportation Safety Board's investigator, Jean Poole.
Why had the complaints come in, the accidents had happened, the railroads were responsive, they had sent engineers and technicians out, Illinois Department of Transportation had sent, numerous times had sent people out to check on the lights. Why couldn't they figure out what the problem was?
The first clue lay buried in the traffic signal maintenance records of the Illinois Department of Transportation.
When I was looking through the reports, I found one interview summary that I was extremely interested in and I'm very excited about, because that was the interview summary of a highway engineer who had actually turned on the signal system initially when they had put the signal system in.
What she had discovered was the highway engineers had altered the way that the town's traffic signals were configured in October of 1994. Before the alteration, an approaching train would turn the traffic light to green well in advance of the train arriving, giving cars on the tracks plenty of time to get out of the way. But a well-meaning engineer had reprogrammed the lights to give priority to pedestrians who wanted to cross Algonquin Road. Now, each time a train approached, a "Don't Walk" sign flashed for 12 seconds to give pedestrians time to clear the road. Only then would the safety system turn the traffic lights green. This extra 12 seconds made the difference between life and death for the children on the school bus.
She did not get the green light because the pedestrians were allowed to walk for 12 seconds. If, in fact, the 12-second pedestrian crossing time had not been programmed in there, and there were, in fact, no pedestrians at the time, the light would have been green for her, and she could have moved out of the way.
Investigators got to the root of the problem, but one question remained unanswered. The highway and railroad engineers had been called out on no less than 12 occasions in the 9 months running up to October the 25th. Why hadn't they found the problem before? Comparing the call-out sheets of the highway and railway engineers, Jean Poole found the answer.
What they were checking when they came out was my box, my railroad box, or my highway box. Is it working the way it's supposed to? And they have diagrams, and they have laptop computers, and they run through the phases. So many seconds for red, so many seconds for green, yellow, etc. Well, they're matching their diagrams and their what they have programmed into that box to do with what's actually happening. Those things were working. The railroad signal systems worked the way they were supposed to work, the way they were designed to work and implemented in place, and the highway signal systems were working. What they weren't looking at was how they were working together.
For the Safety Board, this was enough to conclude their investigation. Their report into the tragedy at Fox River Grove was published 12 months later. In it, they said, the tragedy was a result of a basic lack of communication between the railroad and highway engineers. 5 years later, the tragic events at Fox River Grove are still the subject of argument in the courts. Meanwhile, at the site of the accident itself, new traffic signals have been installed on the south side of the tracks, so when the light is red, vehicles now have to stop before they cross the tracks. And in the town's traffic lights control box, there is now a sign warning engineers that the lights are connected to the railway. As rail companies compete with other forms of transport, operators are looking to new technologies to reduce the risks of train travel. The focus is on things that can be changed inside the rail networks. But just what can be done, and at what cost, to reduce the vulnerability of railways to agents outside of their control? Policing thousands of miles of sprawling track is impossible. Building bridges to replace level crossings is possible, but would be very expensive. In the vital equation of cost versus likely benefit, they're virtual non-starters, which leaves the disturbing possibility of more blood on the tracks.